Hey everybody, it's your friend Chris. It has been a minute. It has been a while since I did a video, and a couple of reasons for that. One, it's been a really busy summer, both in just my work and in my personal life and everything. But now it's September. It's actually September 11th, and I thought, you know what? It's the fall, and things, in some senses, are slowing down, and I'm getting back to having some time to do other things that I find important and interesting, and that, I don't know, give me hope, give me life, give me just things that I can just do to download and de-stress and downshift, or whatever analogy you want to use for that would be. So today's September 11th, 18 years ago, of course, that the September 11th attacks occurred. I remember where I was. If you're around my age, you may have been in college like I was. You may have been in the military at that time, like my cousin. You may have already been in the workforce. But wherever you were, it's something you don't forget. It's something you'll never forget, and it's something that we're still dealing with the repercussions of. And it's hard to believe that 18 years have gone by. And of course, people who we lost that day, and people that we lost as a result of that day in the years since, are on our minds and on our thoughts and in our hearts today. Reason I'm doing this today is not because it's 9/11, and I'm sorry for the shaking here, it's a little unstable. Aren't we all? But the reason I'm doing it today is because I was recently talking to a friend who I haven't seen in person probably since before 9/11. My friend Ryan has been doing a bunch of live streams on Facebook, and I haven't seen Ryan since around New Year's, if I'm remembering correctly, at JP O'Malley's, which was a bar on Allen Street or 15th Street? 15th Street in Allentown back in the day. They had 10-cent wings back when wings were still cheap. And I saw Ryan there one night, and I hadn't seen him since graduation a few years before that. So anyway, gotten back in touch on Facebook, and he's been doing some live streams about some interesting things that he's going through. And I thought, you know what, I need to get back to what I was doing. And another reason that I'm doing it today is because we're heading into the fall, and which puts us roughly a little bit past a year from the time in which we'll know who the Democratic nominee for president is. I expect that to be formally wrapped up in July or August of next year, but it could be wrapped up well before then. We'll see. But I was thinking about our good friend Joe Biden, who I like to make fun of on this channel sometimes. Joe Biden, still the front runner according to most of the major polls. The thing about Joe Biden, I've said a lot of different things about Joe Biden on the broadcast. I've said a lot of things about Joe Biden on Facebook and on Twitter, and I understand that the tone that I strike should be, well, I don't know. I don't want this to be about, oh, Chris hates Joe Biden or whatever, because that's not the case. I have a lot of respect for him in a lot of ways, but it's really important, I think, that we nominate, I'm not even a Democrat, but I'm an independent, but it's really important that the Democrats, I think, nominate a progressive candidate, a true progressive, and I'm talking about Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren at this point. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that Donald Trump figured out how to take a populist or a pseudo-populist message about all the anxieties that we feel economically. Now, I understand that there are also racial anxieties that have played tremendous roles in Trumpism. I get that. I'm not discounting that. But I want to speak for a moment to the economic anxieties when Trump gets praised and when Trump gets applause lines in 2015 and 2016, talking about some of the same things that sound an awful lot like leftist populism, going after big corporations and making sure that the corporations don't outsource the jobs and all those other things. I mean, a lot of that rhetoric that he used, the non-racially charged rhetoric, although some of it still was around economic anxiety that he knew was out there. And I mean, I don't think that he had some big master plan. I think he has instincts. And he has instincts that help him aggrandize himself, and that's what he's built the success that he's had on. So anyway, I really believe that a populist message from a progressive candidate would just totally dismantle most of Trump's support in a general election, especially because Donald Trump in many ways has prepared us to accept populism even more so than we did 4 years ago when Bernie Sanders got close to winning the Democratic nomination. I continue to believe that Bernie Sanders would have defeated Donald Trump in the general. The polling, and it's counterfactual and everything else, but the polling is, all seem to indicate that. Okay, polls can be wrong. Nate Silver can be wrong. But be that as it may, I think that right now, we've got an opportunity for real systemic change that we won't see if we elect Joe Biden, even if Biden beats Trump. And there's some reasons that I say that. A lot of them are obvious. A lot of them you've heard from all kinds of other people. But one of the things that I haven't talked a lot about, that I've been thinking about the last few weeks, is that if Joe Biden is the nominee, and if Joe Biden beats Donald Trump, I think a lot of people feel like we're going to just be able to go back to a pre-Trump normalcy. And I'll use the quote marks because how normal were things before Trump, really? Right? Things were kind of predictable. We knew that politicians would speak in platitudes. We never imagined they would speak the way Donald Trump speaks, that they would act the way Donald Trump acts. But that was a big part of his appeal, that he was not in the system, that he was very antagonistic toward the system, and his personality bears that out. And he got a lot of support based on just his personality, because his contempt for political convention mirrored your contempt for political convention, right? In a lot of ways. And I think Bernie Sanders speaks some of that same language when it comes to the political establishment. Yeah, he's been in Congress for 40 years, but I mean, he's an independent. He's not persona non grata in the Democratic establishment, but he basically is, right? But what I want to talk about is this idea, I think it's a fable, it's a myth, that somehow Joe Biden is going to restore us to a pre-Trump sense of normalcy. I think a lot of people think, oh, well, Joe Biden's a traditional Democrat in the sort of new way Democrat, the third way Democrat, the new Democrat, a Clintonian Democrat in a lot of ways, even though, of course, his public service predates Clintonism by 20 years, 30 years. But there's this myth that if we go back to that way of being, everything's going to be fine. And so I wanted to just use a couple data points here to talk about the idea that things were not normal in 2016, before Donald Trump was president. Things were not normal during the Obama administration. Things were not normal under George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan. Things haven't been normal in this country in a really long time. And I'm going to use some stats from 2016 to get at what I mean. I'm going to focus today on rates of child poverty in 2016, okay? So if we want to believe that all we have to do is turn back the clock to a time when Joe Biden was vice president, that we're going to fix these issues of inequality and these issues that have been plaguing our society for decades, all we have to do is vote for him and he's going to restore us to those kind of halcyon days. So let's go to 2016, okay? These are statistics about child poverty in 2016, and they come from the Children's Defense Fund. And before you think this is some sort of godless socialist organization, their logo is a prayer. Dear Lord, be good to me. The sea is so wide and my boat is so small. Okay, so I want you to hear what the statistics are. In 2016, the good old days, there were 40.6 million people in poverty. And one in three were children. There were 13,253,000 children living in poverty in 2016. That means 18% of the children in this country were living in poverty in 2016. Now, that was actually a decrease from the year before, which means that 2015 was even worse. That good old day was even less good. In 2015, the rate was 19.7%. That's insane, okay? And the way we're defining poverty here is an annual income below $24,563 for an average family of four. That's less than $2,000 a month, $472 a week, or $68 a day. If you want to break it down further, the number of children in the United States of America that were in poverty in 2016, 4 million white kids, okay? 3 million black kids, almost 5 million Hispanic children, almost 500,000 Asian Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian, and almost 200,000 Native American or Alaskan natives. Is that normal to you? Is it normal that in the greatest country in the history of the world, or certainly in the richest country in the history of the world, that 19 or 18% of our children should live in poverty? And I'm just looking at poverty alone. I'm not even looking at things like kids who are not covered by insurance, or elderly people who are in poverty, or elderly people who didn't have insurance, or working people who are stringing together 2, 3, 4 jobs and don't have insurance. I'm not talking about any of those. I'm looking at one criterion here, and that's children in poverty. It strikes me that a lot of people who support Donald Trump style themselves as pretty serious Christians. Well, Jesus has a lot to say about how we treat children, right? How we treat our neighbor. Jesus has a lot to say about what it means to love one another sacrificially. And charity is not the answer. I'm going to run out of time on this video because my phone is, I need to delete some things off my phone, but I want to make the point that poverty and hunger in families and in children has been steadily on the rise overall, trending upward since the late 70s, early 80s. Since the late 70s and early 80s, when we started really seeing the establishment of food banks and soup kitchens en masse in this country that were believed to be temporary reliefs, temporary pressure valves to take some of that pressure off of families who were struggling. And those things have never gone away because we as American society have outsourced these safety nets to charitable groups. But charity is not justice. And even in the Bible, okay, charity is a mistranslation. When we say the greatest of these is charity, with faith, hope, and love remain, the greatest of these is love, or the greatest of these is charity. That word charity that we now translate as love, really the word is agape, the Greek word, which means sacrificial love. Not love as in a feeling, but love as in an action that requires something of you and deprives you of something. It's something that you give and that you leave and that you don't use yourself anymore. To me, that sounds like the fight for justice. To me, that sounds like the long, long, long march toward justice that we're trying to take. Charity is not the answer to inequality. Charity is the answer to kids not starving in the meantime while we get our shit together, right? But when Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren talk about the need to fundamentally restructure certain elements of society, they're talking about the fact that capitalism gone unchecked, and capitalism that's become corporatism, that's become lobbyists, that's become protected and enshrined in what we do in Washington because of who controls the politicians. Okay? That kind of capitalism is what keeps kids in poverty for 40 years. That kind of special interest pandering and politicking is what keeps our society fundamentally unfair and fundamentally unjust. Yes, we have huge opportunities in this country, but there are forces at work with billions of dollars behind them that would seek to undermine even those small advances that we can make generation to generation. When we have 18% of our children living in poverty in the so-called good old days of 2016, okay, that's 18% of our children that are not even probably nourished enough to be able to go to school, to pay attention, and to further their own education, their own self-development, because they're tired and they're hungry and their parents are tired and hungry, and it's not like they're not trying. You might say, well, Chris, you know, all these poor kids are all in the same families, and they're all probably the children of welfare queens. Well, guess what? 30% of these children in poverty live in households where mom and dad are both present and working, or at least trying to work. But you can't make ends meet in 2016 or 2019 in this country on minimum wage. Well, why do they have to make minimum wage? Why can't they get educated? Why can't they get trained? Maybe they grew up in poverty, and maybe they didn't have the access and the means to pull themselves out of poverty that you may have had. Joe Biden represents a return to what we grew to accept throughout the 90s and the 2000s, that poverty was inevitable, and that extreme, I'm talking about extreme poverty, was inevitable and just the natural way of things. We take that as a science, as a truism, but it doesn't have to be the case. And you can look at places all over the world where it's not the case. We are the only developed nation, and we are technologically and economically the most developed nation that wrestles with these problems on this scale on a perennial basis. And that basis, that wrestling with these issues can be eternal if we let it. But we have to do a hard reset based on the momentum that has been built over the past few years, and reaching back to the leaders of the civil rights movement, or the leaders, the evangelical Christian leaders of the anti-slavery movement and of the movement for women's suffrage, that said this world and this nation will be more equitable and more fair and more just, and if you're a Christian, more in the image of Christ, if we care for one another sacrificially. We pay a little bit more in taxes so that everybody not just has a fair shot. I'm talking about so people don't starve, so people don't die because they don't have health insurance. Joe Biden doesn't represent that kind of change. The progressive candidates do. Bernie Sanders most so, and then Elizabeth Warren, who's made a lot of progressive strides in the past few months. My camera's about to fill up. I'm going to sign off for now. I'll do this again. Bye.